We've known that nothing but growth, and to see these empty houses, to see elementary schools be replaced by senior homes makes people have to confront their own mortality, which we know as humans we are not good at doing. Cross-culturally, we can't separate how we as a society discuss population aging from how we feel about individual aging. They're not the same. We will still have innovative societies when median age is 50. Japan is almost there. They remain incredibly innovative. In fact, they've had to be very innovative.
Welcome to the Tao of Chao podcast. This is a podcast about macroeconomics, geopolitics, global finance, investment themes, retirement planning, and behavioral finance, where we will try to find balance and provide a clearer path forward in this uncertain world.
My guest today is Dr. Jennifer Sciubba, one of the foremost experts in the field of political demography. She's the author of 8 Billion and Counting: How Sex, Death, and Migration Shape Our World, and The Future Faces of War, Population, and National Security, published in 2011. She's also the editor of a research agenda for political demography. Her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Harvard Business Review, and Washington Post, and on the TED stage, among other places. Dr. Sciubba is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and is vice chair of the Population Reference Bureau's Board of Trustees. She was formerly a tenured professor in the Department of International Studies at Rhodes College. She has worked for the U.S. Department of Defense on demographic and environmental issues, and she received her PhD in government and politics from the University of Maryland and her Bachelor of Art from Agnes Scott College. And now for our conversation with Jennifer. Jennifer, I have enjoyed so many of the conversations we have had since we met at the Center of Strategic and International Studies. I have finished listening to your 8 Billion and Counting book. I bought the audio version, and you were so kind to offer me this autographed copy, so I want to preserve it. So before we kind of dive into more nuanced aspect of demography, please provide some clear global demographic trends for the, say, 30 years. I know 30 seems a long time, but really it's nothing in demographics. And perhaps some of the political, which is what you are really good at, and economic ramifications. So just want to get us started thinking about that.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really glad to talk to you again. Always a pleasure. And yeah, actually, there's been a ton of change in the last 30 years. And I think that's probably one of the lessons that we'll end up drawing out of this conversation together, is that things can change pretty quickly when it comes to demographics. I always hear a lot of people describe it as this big, slow-moving iceberg, but I think much like we're realizing with the actual icebergs these days, it was slow, and then now they're melting at this rapid pace. And the same thing for demographic change. So I think most of us, around my age and your age, we come to this idea of global population of one that is this exponentially growing global population, because that's the century that we were born into. World population in 1900 was 1.6 billion. And then by the end of the century was 6.1 billion. So that's what we know. We know this big growth. But what we don't necessarily realize unless we're looking for it is that the pace of global population growth really started slowing in the early 1960s. Around 1964, we see that rate of change start to decline. And I think about it like tectonic forces. We don't see what's moving underneath. And what we see, though, is people kind of piling on top. So where we are today in 2023 is it started to catch up. And so, of course, global population is still growing. We just hit 8 billion in November, and that's 2 billion more this century. But we're really probably only going to get a maximum of 2 billion more from this point ever. And what we really see then is the aging of the global population. Fertility down everywhere. And in fact, over 30 countries already starting to shrink.
Fascinating about this notion of really thinking about the future. We already can tell the future, but I think average people walking on the street is not thinking like, oh, we're already slowing, but we are actually still moving forward in an exponential way, actually. I mean, if you think about it, in 1 century, we got 2 billion more people. That's a lot of people. And we expect to have 2 more billion, and this hardly slowing. But what you're really saying is, hold on for a second, there are a number of components to it, right? I mean, there's this end, how many kids we're having, and the other end is how many people are really dying or not dying.
Yeah, and I think also where that growth is happening has changed. And so in the book, I talk about this century, or at least this moment, as one of differential growth. So if last century was exponential, now we look at this century and most of the growth is happening in places where fertility is either still high. And so let's introduce something here called our replacement level fertility, which is basically two, one per parent, keeps the population growth pretty steady, absent migration. So places where it's above replacement level, or where it was above replacement level until fairly recently, so that those cohorts of people of childbearing ages are relatively larger. And so that means we're looking at places like Central Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, versus Europe and East Asia, where populations in many countries are already starting to shrink because fertility declined a long time ago.
So the cover of your latest book says that highlights the three factors that contribute, right, to population. And I love, instead of giving birth, you say sex, death, and immigration, of course. And they put anything you put sex in it sells another 300 million more copies.
Right.
One thing we often believe is that demographics are deterministic, right? And I purposely use that word because I'm going to chat a little bit about that. And it's really important from what I understand. We all have seen the typical demographic chart that is like a python swallowing a peg, how that move. And each cohort moves through this python in a predictable fashion. So it's really seemed to be very deterministic. But you don't deem this country demographics as defining as destiny, which is one major theme that I keep coming back to in my mind, that it's not really deterministic. And tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Yeah, I think if we're looking at the population trends themselves, we could say those are fairly deterministic, meaning that there's a typical path we follow through the demographic transition from high fertility and high mortality to low fertility and low mortality. So in the sense, when I say that we've seen population growth rate globally start to slow, since the 1960s, we know where we're going. We are headed towards a world of shrinking populations eventually. I might still actually be alive when world population peaks. That would be a neat milestone for me, life-wise. It's entirely possible. Certainly my kids will be. And certainly we're all headed towards these aging populations. Anytime fertility starts to fall, really, you're headed on that path. So that part, we know the future. But you're exactly right, Philip. I never say that demography is destiny, because we know that different trends, the same trend actually, will hit different countries in different ways. You could have youthful populations, and there was a lot of talk about youthful populations and their connections to conflict really in the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s. But it was never the case that every country with a youthful or youth bulge population was embroiled in conflict. It wasn't deterministic. There were other factors. And the same holds for our aging populations, which I'm really fascinated with and have been studying for the last 20 years before we really even had aging populations. And we know that the same age structure in different countries doesn't look the same in terms of national budgets, for example. And I think one of the factors that I'll point us to here is governance. So if we look at this youthful or youth bulge population, places with really weak governance, highly corrupt, they tend to have more likelihood of conflict. And the youth bulge age structure there provides the fodder for the flame, even if it's not the spark itself. The same thing in an aging setting where the type of government really matters. I mean, if you have a democracy that's representative and the people really have a large say in policy making, it can be really hard to do long-term policies. And that's exactly what you need in an aging setting, because it is a long-term fundamental shift. Just look at France. And that's the case most people know, but it's just one of dozens of cases like that where it's hard to get raises in retirement ages pushed through. And if they are pushed through, they're not really quite meaningful enough. And you're the expert in this, but certainly we know that to be the case versus, Singapore, for example, where The government has much more central planning, is less responsive to the population, and can do this long-term changes needed to make themselves financially solvent, even if it's other people in the society where the burden kind of falls on them.
So it's really interesting about the type of government and how that reacts efficiently. It's a terrible word, but it's sort of able to push through long-term changes that is more in the interest of the directionality of the population, assuming that governments have that long view and that they don't have to run for office every 2 or 4 years. That they really have a short-term focus, even though they understand what the long-term is, and it struggles a bit. So one of the most prominent of late about this is about China will grow old. I've heard this for the last 10 years before it grows rich. And somehow we uncovered all of a sudden this jump condition of China aging, I think last month when India surpassed China in population. Talk a little bit about this old and then rich, and how perhaps the general consensus of about aging and the society aging may be right and may be wrong.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that, perhaps?
Sure. And I would say on the outset here that scholars have no consensus about it. I think that the media and those who are out there speculating about aging, they've come to a consensus of nothing but alarm, because and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is very understandable. Aging is new. I mean, when I first started studying this, my dissertation was on the politics of population aging in Germany, Italy, and Japan. And I started that in like the mid 2000s. They were the first countries to hit a median age of 35. Now there's over 60 countries with this. Okay, so really has changed in this last 20 years here. But when something's new and you don't know something about it, you just assume it's going to be scary. There's no way this future is going to be good. So most of the discussion about aging is about alarm. But because it is new, and in scholarship, as a political scientist, I'm supposed to say, what has happened? What do we know so far? When nothing had happened in terms of aging, we were free to wildly speculate about the future. But now we do have some years under our belt. And I think I would love for more people across the social sciences to really focus on aging. And I think they're starting to in economics and sociology, but less so in political science, sadly. Come on, I need my discipline here. But to say what has happened so far, we do know examples of countries that have grown old before rich. Not all of the countries that in Eastern Europe grew rich before they got old. So I don't, take that for what it is, but that's the case. And I think the main lesson for us to think about with China is who is going to suffer. And I use the word suffer there on purpose because there are constraints that come from aging. It does change your decision set. We know that if things continue as they always were under expanding populations, you don't shift around slices of the pie in terms of your budget, that somebody loses. And if you're in a country that has a huge social welfare state, and you have these built-in promises to ever-growing numbers of elderly, then it's that budget that really strains, and something has to change there. But if you're in a setting like China, where you don't have these big promises, somebody will carry the burden for that. And in China's case, and in many cases around the world, it will be women, and it will be the family, and it will be old people themselves. And I don't think there's enough recognition of that in the macro trends research, because honestly, we don't like thinking about something so micro, like the household level and an actual elderly person and an actual, tends to be, especially in China's case, woman who takes the care of everyone. Instead, it's just this, the budget will suffer and the economy will suffer. Well, actually, if they can move resources around to meet their goals, as they have done for 70 years, then we have to think more about what's happening at the family level. And so I want to call more attention to that in terms of our analysis. In fact, that's one of the things we know in China's case is continuing to pressure fertility lower, because women would like to opt out of that. It's very difficult, of course, to carry that burden and be expected to raise children and perhaps to work and, all within a society in the year 2023, which is very complicated.
I think it gets even more complicated in China of this after a one-child policy for quite some time. And if indeed women play such, and always has quite frankly, especially in older cultures, women have played a significant role, even though there is a favoring of male, right?
Right. That's what's so it doesn't fit our brains. It's like, wait a minute, you have a son preference, and yet this is so important, right?
I mean, we still go back to agrarian society and how male is preferred because supposedly they're stronger and all the other things. And then, of course, the family name that goes on. And then, of course, the family fortune will pass only on to, all that stuff that is much less significant today. Let me say it differently, is insignificant today on a relative basis if you compare it. And yet they are still favoring male vis-a-vis female. And yet until you need help, then male kind of disappears and only the females are left to handle it. And that, must say, is going to continue to be a burden to China and other sort of cultures that is similar to China. And I know there have been things written, I don't know if scholarly work, but really thinking about one of the examples you kind of talk about in your book, as well as many other folks, about comparing Japan being the contemporary aging society. Actually, as you have stated before in your book, that Korea is aging even faster. But nonetheless, is we have some examples. Now, what you have said, I think, is be careful using examples because those examples may have totally different political background, cultural background, and all the other things, economic and perhaps entitlement as well, that are constrained to what one can do. How do you think about that when you look at somebody like a China, which is obviously in the news all the time now? Anything that happens, China, is mentioned. How do you think about that compared to, should we be thinking about how we learn from the Japanese experience? Mm-hmm. In fact, we're seeing stories that there are villages that is just empty. The houses are abandoned. Right. And then they have found houses underneath beds. There lots of cash just tucked there. They just never spent it. How do we think about that compared to, say, an aging China in your sort of a political scientist mind?
That's a great question. And I think there are two ways to approach it. And that's how I try to approach it. One is, are there lessons that might be universal to aging societies, no matter those other factors? One is, if your population is shrinking, you're probably going to end up with a lot of empty houses. Yeah. That is. I think what we want to say, sounds so scary to all of us. The idea, what you described, is like the beginning of every apocalyptic movie, right? This is like sci-fi. So here we come back with the fear. And, of course, this is a theme that I hit on all the time. We're so scared of this change. But maybe it just is. Much like we have decades of all of us lamenting, oh, look at this. There's another neighborhood going up there. They've just cleared out all of those trees. And here in the United States, we would say, now they're building, 4 dozen houses that look exactly alike, 0 lot line. This is terrible. Well, now all of a sudden, they're going to be vacant. And we're saying, this is terrible. So it's always somewhat terrible. So I think there are some is factors. That is just the way it will go in an aging society. But here's another one that's pretty common. In every aging society I've looked at, the fear and the discussion is over the shrinking of the prime working age population, which of course we talk about a lot, you as well, somewhere around 20, depends on when people enter the workforce, to somewhere around 60, depends on when they exit. And the idea that this is shrinking is the thing that we kind of start all of our articles with. But in every one of these aging societies, there are huge proportions of that group that are underutilized in the workforce. It might be different. It might be youth. It might be women. It might be older people. It might be people of certain races or ethnicities or educational levels or regional. But that is the case. So there are some universal is. But when we think about China, we can probably look at some of those. We know that this is something that's happening. And in fact, in China's case, we could say, let's look at, in fact, women and older workers who are not really utilized. There's also a lot of talk about, when I say older workers, there was an interesting article in the New York Times last week, you may have seen, of age 35 as the one to hit where people have a hard time getting hired after that. Sometimes it's women can't get hired before age 35 because employers are afraid they'll have children. But this is universal, right? We could cross out the word China and stick some other country there. But I think that's one approach, is this universality. The other is to look historically. And so I'm doing a book right now with two other authors. One's a demographer and one's a historian. And we're looking at different cases around the world of how the politics of population has been negotiated over time, really since the end of World War II. China is one of the case studies that I have, and it's been really interesting to look at discussions of population really kind of going back to 1920s and 30s until now. And even though it was once about population growth and sometimes about immigration or emigration, now it's about shrinking. The discussions and the politics of it all sound very familiar. So you kind of cross out, shrinking and replace with growing. And so I think we can learn a lot when we look, how has this country approached this issue historically? And in China's case, of course, it's been very strong-handed. And I think that's something for us to pay attention to, because China's leaders have known, they started 40 years ago writing about the coming waves of aging because they knew what their fertility policies were doing to the demographics. And we do know it's predictable. Like, we can see the python swallowing the, whatever. So they, they've had a really heavy-handed approach to population management. And I think it would be not out of the realm of possibility for countries that have had heavy-handed ways of managing population when it was growing to do heavy-handed ways of trying to manage it when it's aging and shrinking. And so that's something I really worry about as well.
We always trying to figure out how to predict about the future and getting it right. And I'm afraid that most of us, at least mere mortals, don't get to do the prediction game too well. And what you have through your book and through discussions and elsewhere that I've heard is there has to have some dosage of humility when you think about all this, because we need to be very specific, like you said, more micro. Sometimes from country to country, they may not replicate the same way as we would put a broad brush over the world. So the question is, what is so devastating for a country with a stable but aging and shrinking population? So you mentioned a little bit about productivity. You mentioned a little bit about, we think old is, you can even think of 35, right? You mentioned. Is it because the potential for unsustainable fiscal support for the elderly is, or lack of ever increasing standard of living are those the main issues that we're struggling with, or aging is actually fine now that I've aged? So I always think aging is fine, right? Yeah. The other thing that we always think about is when you ask every group, what age do you think is old? And the 30 will say 40, 40 will say 50. They are always 10 years ahead. So if you ask a 70-year-old, say, 80 years old, you are old. But so I'm just curious, maybe we can just quickly think about what are the challenges that we feel that old aging society is so terrible?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I don't want to downplay, as much as I talk about alarm, I don't want to downplay that those are real when we think about the financial strains. When you've had a system, even think about not just the system, the rules of the game, but every theory we even had about economics was written within a setting of what seemed like was going to be infinite population growth. And so our values were set around that. Everything about the way we are today was established in this system. And now the structure changed, and yet we're left with the same values, the same theories, the same rules of the game. And so I don't want to downplay that something's got to change. And it's in that change that we come back to government types, because change is harder in some settings than others. And so, as a political scientist, we get down into the weeds of all kinds of things, like how centralized is the government versus the federal system? Do you have this familialist system versus, so it's very, you can really get into the weeds on that. But I think we should, as scholars, and there aren't enough people doing that, to say, okay, under what conditions does this strain actually start to hurt people, hurt the government? Government's supposed to be of the people, but of course we know it floats out there like this, behemoth. So we will see some strains. Some things will have to change. And some places will be more resilient than others. And that's a word I really want to emphasize with this because, again, I'm not trying to flip the script as if I think, oh, this is, Pollyanna future. But some societies are better set up to be resilient in the face of this change than others. We could borrow that same lesson from climate change. Of course, we know that some places are more responsive in terms of disaster or, even just to the people absent sudden disaster. So we think about how can we build resiliency into the system? Something we might want to talk about, of course, is that there are, we've said with aging with East Asia, Europe, but we also have sets of countries that are aging that we don't really think of. Iran, Cuba, Thailand, they're aging so quickly. They actually have possibility to build some resilience into their system now. So yes, there will be strains, and we need to start paying attention to where are the points of resilience. But I do think that fear comes back in again and drives us because I think why are people so afraid of population aging? I think it does get down to this idea of an existential threat that people are. It's hard to imagine what we've known that nothing but growth, and to see these empty houses, to see elementary schools be replaced by senior homes makes people have to confront their own mortality, which we know as humans, we are not good at doing cross-culturally. We can pretend like, well, there are some religions that really work this in there. Everybody gets nervous about this. Okay. We get nervous about the wrinkles on our face, and we get nervous about, will our bodies kind of falling apart at the very last few years of life. And so I think we can't separate how we as a society discuss population aging from how we feel about individual aging. And I think, besides the very real financial strains, we've got to start talking about how those two things are not the same. Population aging and individual aging, they're not the same. We will still have innovative societies when median age is 50. Japan is almost there. They remain incredibly innovative. In fact, they've had to be very innovative because they faced this new system. So they've got, robotic cats that sit on your lap and monitor your vital signs, and washing machines for elderly people, and so on. So it's not the idea that everyone in the society is old. That's not what population aging means. And I'd love to see us start separating out the societal from the individual in this sense.
So perhaps the emotion from the logic, right? So the frontal lobe from the primal brain. So you brought up something that's really interesting and something that is very contemporary. It's about this OpenAI, ChatGPT, and so on. And this big news made a lot of money on Wall Street. The first quarter, first half. Now all of a sudden the race is on, so to speak, as if it hasn't been on. I think it's always been on. I think China is doing its own version, and US and the West is doing its own version. So I appreciate your thought about, AI and other technology that's threatening many jobs and human functions. At least that's what we think the trend is going to be. Yeah. Does this advancement actually, or even out, help or even out the shrinking population size just in time? So if we're looking at Japan and say, well, dying off, or Korea and or Singapore, what have you, and that they don't want immigration in the case of Japan for sure, and I think that's true in Korea as well. They're far more ethnocentric in a society standpoint. When AI actually just it's like heaven sent, great, now we can do more with less people. Does that actually offer them an advantage because they've been thinking along that way? They're thinking in a way that they can implement, right, in a society in a practical way because they just have lack of people. What's your thought on that compared to somebody like right now in the United States?
Yeah. I think it's entirely possible that it can help offset some of the loss. I'm always careful to use negative words, but the loss and the shrinking of the working age population, because you can gain efficiency. So to the extent that it can help us gain efficiency, then it does make up for some of that. And we're always looking to gain in terms of efficiency, whether or not we have a growing or shrinking population. So, I think at this point, it's very early for us to tell the harm versus the gain. And I don't even mean the harm like robot overlords taking over. I think
No.
about things like, older people in every society are the least technologically savvy of the generations, and they're very vulnerable to scams, and AI can make them even more vulnerable to scams. So I think, as long as when we have these conversations about AI and aging, we think about both the pros and the cons of it, even in terms of, I think a lot about older workers and how do you retrain them to keep them in the workforce, depending on how AI turns out in terms of, what flavor we have here. Maybe it's going to be even harder to train up an older group of workers, 65 to 75 years old, to be comfortable using this kind of technology to stay on in the workforce. But also, it could be that they replace some of the youth workers, because we've seen that. And that's the interesting thing when we look at these aging societies, they often have really high youth unemployment.
Yes.
And so it's hard to make sense of that. And so I think it is just too soon to tell in terms of AI. There's a lot of promise for offsetting some of the strains of aging, but the knockoff effects of it could actually be make an even worse situation economically, socially.
So I think you're hitting on some really important micro aspects. The actual, we have to live within that society, and how does that reality hurt us and help us? But from a macro standpoint, where a society is getting older, in other words, they are having fewer portion of their population being quote unquote a productive portion of their career, or human capital is what we used to call it, right? Human capital is coming down faster than we thought. But if some of that can be made up through productivity, through AI, through robotics, through lots of other things that, in fact, they're talking about AI creating their own AI. It's like computers generating their own sort of computing. So that is yet to be experienced and yet to know. But does that give the fast aging society an equalizer to the less fast aging society? Is really what I'm trying to think about.
I think it could, but it's one of many factors that could be an equalizer because, again, with this political scientist hat on, I know it's never just about the technology being available. You talked about human capital. I actually think that's incredibly important because what about the education system? I live in a setting in the United States where there's like a 50% high school graduation rate, so technology is not the only thing that can give you an advantage. Your education system, the types of match between your skills of your people and the industries that are there, that can also give you an advantage. So I would put it on the menu. And that's the way I think about a lot of these things with aging, that there's never going to be this one thing, but there's a menu that we have to build this resilience in a society. And I think strategic use of technology, openness to using it, investment in it is absolutely one of those factors that can help a society be more resilient in the face of aging.
So can we go back and talk a little bit about immigration?
Sure.
I'd like to explore that a little bit more if possible. Immigration appear to be the variable factor is less deterministic because actually people moving around either in country, which is not true immigration, but out of the country and to other countries or to other cultures to sustain a population stability or growth, to get the youth back, if you would, right? This all sounds really nice and calm. But tribalism, as you know, is alive and well. Xenophobia is certainly alive and well. Economic divide is alive and well. And simple discrimination, which is form of, tribalism, if you want to call that, have proven to be a sort of a non-starter for many countries, or not in a truly meaningful, sustainable way, right? In this country, the strength of this country is through immigration, in fact, the founding of the country and so on. And it's the diversity in so many ways have contributed to the American exceptionalism, if you want to call it that, right? So you mentioned that by 2050, I think in your book also that we expect to have 10 billion people. That's about top out in the world. And the top 9 countries are expected to be in the global south. Or I think they used to call that third world, and now we call them politely global south. I mean, I figure, are they all really the south? Anyways, according to World Bank's projection that 1 in 4 of the people will be in sub-Saharan Africa. At the same time that if greenhouse gas emission continue unabated, large areas of that area will be considered uninhabitable because of too hot or dry and conditions 50 years from now. So where will these people go, and what would be the political ramifications? Since you are a political scientist, I hope that you can help us. And really, that's a great big headache. I don't think they can just move within themselves because they are all going to go through this problem. So your thoughts will be appreciated.
Yeah, I think, the political scientist in me wins this, because when I think about migration or immigration, I think it's not a demographic issue. It's not an economic issue. It's not a climate issue. It is a political issue. And so we do still live in this world of 200-ish sovereign states. And I feel comfortable saying that even when we think about the exceptions to this sovereignty. And, I remember being in college at a time when we the buzzword was globalization. And it was the idea that we were going to see this borderless world, and then became a professor myself and so on. And it never happened. Those borders have remained so strong throughout our history, and they stay that way. And so I think that is the important point, though, with migration. People may need to move, and they won't be able to move. So it's really similar to when I talk about how somebody will carry the burden or the strain of population aging. Who will it be? And so who suffers and they need to move and can't? Well, it'd be the person who needed to move and can't move. I think we've had too much focus. It's dying down some, but if we had had this conversation maybe a year and a half ago, the conversation really we would have led with, what about those projections of the 200 and something million people that will be flooding into the world's richest countries?
Yeah.
And I think most people realize that where that conversation was going wrong is it was entirely apolitical. You're not going to have that number of people flooding in because they will protect their borders. And I actually think the US is a great example of that protection now, because you could say that what's happening on the US border is evidence that people are coming in droves, but I say it's evidence that we are sending people back in droves. Not everybody gets to come in and stay. And there are ways even in the US that system could be made much more humane and efficient, and also meet our economic goals. That's political decisions that would make it more humane, efficient, and meet our economic goals, right? So I think it's all about the politics. And so when we are projecting out the future, yes, we should expect that the environment of the world's fastest growing countries in terms of population, it will continue to be a strain. And that mismatch between population and resources will be real. And so we have to start thinking, what will happen to those people? How do we make sure that they have a good quality of life? How do they're also the countries in the world that have some of the weakest governance right now.
Yeah.
And so, how do you strengthen the governance capacity? And again, this word, resilience of those countries to meet the needs of those people with those both population and resource strains. And I think what I worry about is this differential growth. Like I said, this century is about a demographic divide. Well, if you have that set of countries with these resource strains and growing populations, and then you have a set of countries that are shrinking with their own types of resource strains and shrinking populations, then do they have enough commonality to look at this at a global level? Do the countries that have the most money to potentially give as aid care to do that for countries that need it the most? And so I think that there are global governance global aid implications of this that we need to start shaping the conversation around.
Fascinating you are talking about that. One of the article I read, and this is nothing new, you know this, as a superpower competition, which is the lightest form of competition we're talking about here, either decoupling or de-risking, I cannot tell the difference. But in any event, between China-centric or Asia-centric or China-centric and American dominance, one thing has been clear is that America has rallied the support of all advanced countries, democratic countries per se. And when I put even democratic countries, I'm not really sure all democratic countries, but certainly the alliance countries, or Anglo-Saxon countries, if you would, right? And then China saying, well, gee, where are all the remaining holes? I mean, they've got 200 countries, and let's say United States got 50, if there's that many, 50 countries on their side. Well, there's another 150 to go. And those 150 are the global South countries. I mean, from Cuba all the way to South Africa to, Sri Lanka, what have you. So if China continues to support and to have allegiance with this group, which is where the future population is going to be, and America is aligned with our friends, right, who are actually aging fairly rapidly. Isn't that dynamic telling you something that is changing? If you like youth, well, you're going to like the global South a little bit more. If you like, sort of the future, it seems like the global South have more promise in some ways, not absolute. Yeah, could you talk a little bit about that and how does that really work?
I think you hit on an important point. When I first started looking at this intersection of population and national defense, I talked a lot about strength in numbers. And so I wasn't using the term resilience back then, but I was thinking about how do you offset population losses? And so from a national defense perspective, alliances, that's the way to go. You say, well, we have fewer people, but if we band with those people over there, now we all of a sudden have more. So I think actually we should look at that, anytime you're building alliances as your population changes, that is an adaptation. A couple of things on this idea that there would be these two blocks and that the blocks would be really different. While it is certainly true that you've got the global South, so to speak, if we're going to give these two blocks, is much younger and growing. They also have an increasing number of countries that they're just rapidly aging. I mean, that's one of the most fascinating things about today. So including China, who's rapidly aging and shrinking. And so I would say that even within that block, you've got some population differences there. And if those countries aren't resilient, they actually could end up weaker in 20 years than today. So if you're China and those are going to be your friends, then you may have chosen a group of countries that will be much weaker because the bulk of the money is still in those U.S. allies, right? So where is the money? Then I also think we're back to this, age-old question, or at least modern age-old question about how close are China's friendships really? Yeah. Are they friendships of convenience? Is there something built, a better, stronger foundation than that? And so I think we kind of get away from this question about demographics and more into this question about alliance structures in general and balancing and versus bandwagoning and so I think it gets hard to overlay demographics on top of that because there's so many other factors at play there.
So we go back to demographics not deterministic.
That's right. Absolutely.
We go back to say, just because you're young doesn't mean you're going to be successful. Just because you're old doesn't mean it's the end of the world. I mean, from an aging standpoint.
Yeah. If it were me, I would always want the alliance with the aging, shrinking country because that is where the money is. That's often where the technology is. And so I also know that for better or worse, in most of these countries, they've got rules of the game set in place that if they needed to throw a bunch of money at national defense because of a crisis, they could do so, and they have the money to do it. And so, like, if I were trying to pick a side, that's the side I would pick.
So when you think about America, we have succeeded. If you look at the top companies, especially technology companies, many of the CEOs are immigrants, actually, still today, which is mind-boggling, right? And yet, I think we have. I don't want to say turn the page, but we have certainly be more specific about what type of immigration we're seeking, right? So we kind of pick and choose what we want. Is that the future for America, you think? You think this is where we are, is saying, we only want the best and the brightest in these areas because we need help here, but not so much here? Is that a kind of future immigration policy you envision in developed countries?
I think in America's case, there's very little chance that in the next 20 years we have any kind of coherent immigration policy put forth. So immigration of the next 20 years is going to look basically like it has the last 20 years because it means you have to have had people agree to make a set of rules. So, it's funny about immigration policy in democracies or in, let's say, liberal states, we would call them. You might say it's logical if they do this. But the rules of the game are not set up to match that whatsoever. And people also do not necessarily vote based on economic logic. They might vote based on emotion and fear, as we're coming back to that. So I don't think we'll see anything change in U.S. immigration policy in the next 20 years. Really and truly, I say, I'm laughing about it. I'd actually take some money bets on this one. I think, though, that there are countries that have already set rules of the game that they can shift the levers in a way that permit people of certain skills backgrounds to come in more easily than others. Like Canada would be an example of this. You could compare policy setups cross-nationally to say, how much ability does the government have year upon year to turn the spigot in one way or the other? I think actually it gets really complicated, though, when we talk about immigration offsetting aging, because, there's a difference between somebody coming to the country to live and settle permanently. In that case, they actually contribute to the aging of the population because it tends to be the case that they move around the same median age of the current population. So it's not getting younger. So it's not necessarily the case that immigration makes your country younger. It might add more workers, but if those people stay, then now they will be aged in that setting as well. Then you've got like the Gulf states model or Singapore's model that says, come on in for a short period of time and then leave. So then you get the workers, but without any of the stuff that comes along with it. You don't get their religion. You don't get their politics. You don't get their families. You don't get them as aged people. So, again, I think this is another case where we say, of the 200 and something countries in the world, there are different ways to look at the contribution of immigration to offsetting some of the negative effects of population aging. And that it will all be about the politics.
So this is where a liberal democracy like the United States can get really messy. Because we don't have a authoritarian, if you want to contrast, extreme, that says this is the way we're going to do it and get on with it kind of thing. Maybe right, maybe wrong.
Exactly. It's not, doesn't mean it's humane. But also it's not necessarily humane to leave all these border crunches and fly people around. So, there's a lot of inhumanity that comes along with immigration, I would say, globally. And that's what makes it very difficult. It's never just about that labor migration. There's so much more that goes with it.
So let's sort of sum up the last part that we didn't spend much time on is the financial aspect. If you look at the pie, the U.S. income pie, the budget, and if you look at it today and look at it 20 years from now, there is nothing left in the budget except entitlement, which is basically Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid. And so if indeed this is what you mentioned earlier, where a society for its kindness, for its long-sightedness to say we recognize a growing segment of population going to be aging and we need to take care of our people and we need to promise something. Now, I'm spinning it positively because I don't think that was how Social Security came about, because it was actually much darker than what I said. But assuming this all kindness and it's wonderful. And right now, when anyone does retirement planning, that single anchor for the average American is Social Security. And it's the only thing that will keep up with, today the new thing is inflation, right? So it not only provides you a steady stream of income, but it's also adjusted for inflation. So it's the bedrock of many people's retirement income. And we talked about 5-to-1, 3-to-1. Now it's 2-to-1 coming up to support this. Are we going to get to a 1-to-1? It's like that's unthinkable.
Right.
So we have all these pressure going on, and it's known as the political third rail. Nobody
Yep.
able to really say, well, let's not do this, or let's make it so much of a change that they're not gonna get reelected.
Yep.
What is a political demographer or a scientist think about this real challenge in, just take America for a moment? What does that mean
Yeah.
going forward, and from an affordability standpoint?
This is the key question. It's great to kind of wrap with thinking about this, because this brings in both the demography and the politics.
Yes.
And it actually brings us back to this idea of crisis. So even though I tend to be the anti-alarmist in terms of aging, I think the place where we could warrant alarm is to say, there is no political will to change this system. The system will break,
Yeah.
and then a new system will come out of it. What does that system look like? So I think where most analysis stops is it says, oh no, the system breaks. And then like that's the end of the story. But we have to say, and then what? And then new rules of the game are written that will hopefully be more resilient and sustainable. Does that mean that it happened seamlessly? No, somebody lost in there. So who's going to lose? And I think that's really our task to figure out, at what point does it break?
Yes.
And then it will break and be rebuilt in a new way. But who's going to suffer in the interim?
Absolutely.
And so I don't know if it will be my generation that will suffer from that. But honestly, a lot of us, I'm like on this cusp of the Gen X millennial. We have house wealth, at least. We were able to afford houses. Our student debt is not nearly as high as millennials. And then the Gen Z. So I think somebody's going to lose. Politics is all about winners and losers. Kind of wonder if it will be these younger millennials and Gen Z who are the ones that will suffer before it's rebuilt in a resilient way.
So when 40 years ago we talked about gerontocracy, right? I haven't quite seen it yet. I mean, there's shades of it, right? But gerontocracy is assuming these people are going to live longer and going to not die, and that piece of the total pie remains fairly robust in terms of the amount of people in that group. The younger generation, Gen Z, millennials, what have you, they are the other end of this barbell. They are a pretty substantial group of people. So we can talk about gerontocracy all we want. They are dying off. I mean, they can't live to 200, right? They're going to die off around 100, let's say 90. These people are growing, and they are the one who's supporting this group. So I think change is going to be inevitable.
Yeah.
And then it's not going to be a third rail. We're not always going to have a president that's 80 or 85. We're going to have presidents in 45, 50 who represent their view.
Yep.
And the Congress as well. So is it fair to say, let's not be so sanguine about, when I plan for retirement, this money is going to be around forever? Is it something that we should be thinking about? And I'm not asking for you to give investment advice here. That's not what I meant. But really thinking about, it is not always a given. There isn't a given about anything. And that the past is not about the future. The past is about the past. And is the future going to be different? And I think the way that I'm asking is I'm suggesting that there is going to be a difference.
I would just underline everything you said. Yes, I think you're exactly right. And I always joke that as a political demographer, I did approach my retirement in a really different way, because I saw both the demographic numbers and I saw the politics. And so I remember getting my first job as a professor, I think I was 28, but I had been saving for retirement since I was in college, because I'd been interested in this. And it's when you look through this lens, and that's how I think about demography, by the way, it's like a lens to read the world. I remember sitting down with the TIAA CREF planner, and he said, first question, do you want to assume you'll have Social Security or not? I said, oh, no. We're going to assume I will not have it. Then if I have it, great. So my planning, in my late 20s started from that point. We better assume we won't have this, just in case. And I feel like that's why I want people to approach the world, try on the hat of a demography, or try on a pair of glasses to look at the world through a demographic lens, because it will lead you to ask different questions, look for different answers, and just see the world in a different way. And for me personally, on an income level, I said, yep, not sure that this will be here. We know it's hard to change the rules of the game. So it may collapse and be rebuilt. It may, that crisis point could be the vote that changes it. And that's okay. That's how you get people to make it not a third rail, is that you come to a crisis and you say, okay, we have to do this. So I had the same approach when thinking about national security, by the way. There's all the discussion in that realm about, well, will people be able to afford a military? Well, sure, if there's a big enough threat, they will. So there's the idea that, you can rally resources around a goal, even in an aging state.
So my final statement to that is, if you remember the European crisis over a decade ago, the great financial crisis, and people are not willing to change until they are facing the end of the barrel of a gun. And that's human behavior. So unless and until it is absolutely need to change, we're not going to change. And that is very unfortunate, because people like you have been, I don't want to say shouting, but been very clear about what are some of the clear direction, and that we need to be thoughtful about it, and how we anticipate it and do something about it while we still can. The reality is that in my field, people have undersaved, underinvested, under everything. And they say, well, but we still have Social Security, right? And that I can still move to some lower cost countries and live a decent life because I just have that check mail over there, until that check is gone, or until that check is cut in half. And those are not only possibility, probability is really the reality thinking, because we are already a very indebted country. We're able to get away with it for many reasons, that we are the reserve currency of the world. We are the strongest country in the world, and people are willing to subsidize us. And one day in a multipolar world, maybe the willingness to subsidize is diminishing. And what does that mean? And so that is chapter 2 of our conversation. Jennifer, so, time has just flown by so quickly. And thank you so much for your insights. I always learn. And your foresights. I'm putting that in global.
Thank you.
Yeah, on global demographics, politics, and human behavior, really. So thank you so much, Jennifer. And I hope to have a conversation again with you. And thank you for your time.
You can always find more episodes by visiting philipchow.us/podcast, or find us on your favorite podcast app. You can always leave us feedback, ask questions, or request a topic for us to discuss by sending an email to pc@philipchow.us.
Views expressed in the Tao of Chao podcast are individual opinions, and they do not represent the employers of each guest or the firm each guest is associated. Our podcasts are for educational and informational purposes only and should not be deemed or viewed as investment advice or recommendations. Please consult your personal financial advisor, investment expert, or investment fiduciary before taking any actions about your plan and investments.